everybody to the second session of roundtables to discuss some of the most pressing issues we have today for natural history museums. And today is my great pleasure. My name is Gonzalo Giribet from the MCC at Harvard University. And it's my great pleasure today to have here the most distinguished, or one of the most distinguished panel of speakers. Dr. Gurr from the Natural History Museum in London, Lisa Gugenheim from the American Museum of Natural History, and Bruno David from the Museum, the National Museum of Natural History of France. I'm not going to try to butcher the name in French.
Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle.
Exactement. And I thought, they sent us to the moderators. They asked us to think about some questions that we could discuss in these panels. And some of the issues that I thought about the panel have been touched upon in some of the presentations that we've seen today. But I think that these could be a very good time to discuss several aspects that we really need to think about in a very calm, pause way, go back, rethink some of the issues that we are facing today in society, and they really affect our museums in many dimensions, in many ways. And these issues have to do, one, with what is the population that is being attracted to sciences, and how can we increase that diversity, right? And that's something that, at least in the US, I know in the UK also, it's been very important to reach to more segments of the population. This doesn't mean to reach to that gap that we were identifying between school kids and then the parents that come up with the kids. This is how to attract to those segments of our population that haven't really been a part of our museum communities. And there are a lot of very important things to do there. And we have to think that in museums, we have often seen other groups that are not Europeans or North Americans as exotic groups. And we have exhibits that are very insensitive today towards those populations. So that's one of the themes that I like to touch upon. The other one has to do with the museums reckoning with the practices that we did in the past, things that we will not do today. And what can we do about them? We can just say, well, it wasn't me, it was in the past, or we can think forward how to do that, because it's not unrelated to the first question. And then also how we incorporate new technologies, and this has to do not only about displays, but in our museum, we're thinking about the future and DNA. Are we going to sequence everything that we have around us? Is it important? Is it not? Or what can we do? Maybe things that we cannot do today, but we might foresee that those things could be done in the future. So these will be the three topics. I think we could start by the first two topics and see if we have a little bit more time for the third one. But I think that the position of museums in society and how we bring more people into museums and how we become more egalitarian, if you want, it's a very important question. And we might start by your opinion on some of these matters.
Sure, thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here. And happy birthday, congratulations. 250 years is awesome, so well done. Round of applause for yourselves. But Gonzalo, thank you. I mean, look, a really important topic. And again, there are many different aspects. I mean, we tend to think of 4 dimensions of the whole agenda. There's our workforce, which on the whole is not as diverse as it could or should be. There's, as you clearly touched on, the audiences, which in some ways is the hardest nut to crack. There's the collections and how we interpret and display those. And then there's also the scientific research community, which we all play a part in. And across all of those, I don't think any of us would say that we feel we've perhaps done enough to just access all the talent that is out there. So again, just in our own country, we know that nearly half the population sees museums in general, and natural history museums, as just not for them. Not relevant, too scary. We have, if you know our museum, it's a very large, rather grand Victorian building. It's quite intimidating. And I talk to a lot of visitors, particularly young kids, perhaps from sort of more diverse or less well-off communities. And they just say, I take one look at that and I just think there's no way. I'm not welcome. I'm just going to feel uncomfortable. I don't even want to walk through the door. So that's a real issue. And I think we need to acknowledge it, and it's all those dimensions. I think we should also acknowledge that lots of people have tried lots of things without a huge amount of success. I mean, we do very well. As it was great to see so many school kids and so many schools coming in here. And again, we do very well. If you look at the diversity, ethnic diversity of our school groups, it's nearly 50% broader ethnically diverse disadvantaged groups, or whatever the current language is. But actually, it's really hard to translate that into getting the families to come. And actually, what we found is you need to work incredibly hard to, as you were saying, be a little bit more sort of humble about how you interpret. So in terms of how we present the displays, we've had to go back and just ask ourselves the questions, have we been thoughtful enough? Give you a very simple example. We have a lot of the Joseph Banks collection. Banks was obviously the naturalist who travelled with Captain Cook, the first Europeans to have visited Australia and New Zealand. And they brought back some extraordinary images, the Banks images, so, all of the copper plates, the drawings, they're fabulous. What's less well known, and what we've never, until very recently, even acknowledged, is that actually most of those images were executed by local artists. That's where they got their expertise about the flora and the fauna, that's where they got the names from, and actually those are the people who, if you like, the artisans and the artists who actually executed these pictures. And we've never really acknowledged that before. So I think in our collections, we've now got a very simple ABC. You've got to acknowledge, and I do agree with you, you have to acknowledge the sins of the past. You can't hide from them. We try and broaden our interpretation. So there's been a lot of noise about cancel culture, get rid of people. We don't do that, but we want to broaden the number of perspectives we bring to these things. And then you have to communicate. And actually that communicate point, so far in our experience, has been the most effective way of actually reaching some of these groups. So for example, we had an enormous program around Diwali, just getting particularly sort of people of Asian origins to come in. And actually what we discovered there is that if you want to create a really engaging experience, the family is not the unit. We're very used to having families and their kids or grandparents and their kids come in. That is not the unit that works for those communities. Then at the weekend, it's a very big social group, it's 20 or 30. So actually we had to create a series of quite tailored events in the museum with relevant content, relevant collections, but ones that were sufficiently compelling that they'd say, we'll bring 30 people in and make that our family weekend experience, as opposed to just going to the park or somebody's garden. So it's there. I think it's a massive issue. It's one we're trying to work hard at, but we're just here, and we'll only feel good about it once we've reached, I think, population representative visitors, employees, researchers, and actually full visibility of the collections. And I think I'm sure my colleagues have been working hard on this, but I think it's something we probably ought to all accept. We've got work to do on. Lisa or Bruno.
My turn. First thing I would like to tell is that at least in France, probably also in other Latin countries, natural history is not among the exigible of culture. That is to say, if you make a confusion between Shakespeare and Goethe, it's a tragedy, you are a stupid guy. But if you consider that an oyster is a crustacean, it's not a problem. And the mistake is about the same. So we start from that. So we need to disseminate natural history culture in the population, all the more that we are facing an environmental crisis which is crucial, which is critical. And how to reach a maximum of population? Of course, we have our galleries, our gardens, our zoos, and people are coming and enjoying that. But it's always almost the same categories of people. We have a lot of families in the Great Gallery of Evolution. We have more adult people in the Mankind Museum, the Musée de l'Homme on the Trocadero Hill. It's a different population, but whatever. And so we try to do different things. First thing, we develop a lot of podcasts available that you can load on different places, and we did that in relationship with big mainstream French radios. For example, we did one called Bestiole. Bestiole is a kind of familiar word to tell a small animal. And we decided to do some very short podcasts, 5-7 minutes, for young children between 3 and 7 years old. And regarding not ordinary animals, but not the usual bear, lions, elephants, and so on, but worms, spiders, sea urchins, and mussel, and those animals are very lively. And it was loaded more than 5 million times. So you see, you reach a lot of people. Of course, my granddaughter probably loaded I don't know.
It's 1 million.
10,000 just by herself. But you see, it's a way to do that, and to do also our podcast for adults people. We try to undo. We are doing that always in collaboration with mainstream radio, so that we reach a lot of people. Then we are also identified, starting from the core of Paris and going outside. In the suburb of Paris, I signed a kind of contract last week with one place north to Paris, where in this small place, in these small territories, we have more than 100 different countries represented in the population. And this is a population which is not far away. It's a matter of less than 30 minutes in the metro. It's not a matter of cost because the entrance is free up to 26 euros in the museum. But people just would like to come. And we don't know why. So we decided to go outside and to present them what is the museum, to enter in contact. And we are in contact with a fantastic mayor of this small city outside. It's close to Paris. It's the same urban area. And we decided to do the things, and so that people can come inside the museum. So this is an action to drive populations that just said, oh no, it's not for me, and don't come. Another kind of populations are in pitch populations. So we have signed a contract with the prisons in France so that we can disseminate the cultural aspect of natural science also in prisons. And last thing I did is to have also a collaboration with the railways in France. And we pick up 6 railways starting from Paris, small lines, not high-speed train, small rail tracks. And we pick up on the line small cities that corresponding to white areas for culture. There is no culture. There is no natural history museum. Just people don't know what is it. And on the, what is the Koen, the platform of the different stations, so we pick up 36 stations in total, in very small cities. Mm-hmm. And on the platform, we disseminate scientific culture with pictures and text about the collections of a museum so that people can see what it is. It's not only for people to come to visit us, but it's just to disseminate the culture. Because we are really facing this problem that you probably don't have at this level in the United States or maybe in England or in Northern Europe in general. But in Spain, in Italy, and France, people just don't care about natural history. Mm. We have Victor Hugo, we have other Dante or Cervantes, and it doesn't matter. Our history is a crustaceans, that doesn't matter. So we are really engaged very strongly in that. We are also organizing tribunes, which is a kind of entertainment with the public. It's not a workshop like that one, but for example, we did one on the risk. I explained that to Peter yesterday. We did one tribune on risk. So the people are coming, it's free, the entrance is free, they can come, and we try to explain them what is the risk in their life. And for example, we distribute to the public small boxes with 20 candies inside. And we tell them, among those 20 candies, 2 have a very bad taste. Are you taking the risk to eat? The alea is 1 on 10, 2 on 20. This is the alea. The vulnerability is how you like the candies. Are you starving or not? Do you like sugar or not? And if you cross the area with vulnerability, you have the risk. So we explain the risk in tectonics, in normal life, in environmental risk, and so on. Playing with the public. We did one on plastic, and we asked the people to throw out their pockets or bag, all the plastic items that they have, and to try to sort them, what is absolutely necessary for me, what is not. And so they start to think about that. And we try to do things that usually museums are not doing, in order to disseminate the culture of natural history.
Lisa.
Very interesting. Well, I think to add on to the conversation, 2 things that are going on in the American Museum of Natural History is a significant focus on young people of color in communities in New York City and focusing on the developmental point that they arrive at where women and children of color do not pursue science, either in high school or in undergraduate and therefore graduate education. So the program that we've developed, including establishing a graduate school that confers PhDs, supports research experience for undergraduate students, as well as now conferring a Master of Arts in Teaching. And the reason we did that was because teachers play such a pivotal role in developing the identity of young people as curious, and then over time as capable of pursuing advanced degrees. And so we're conferring degrees for teachers in earth science, which is in the United States and New York State, the gateway science to then biology and chemistry and physics. And those teachers that we graduate are in what we call high need schools. These are high poverty schools. And the teachers receive free education and credential, and they commit for 4 years of supporting young people. And what we've learned, and the research tells us, is the development of those young people's identity is as important as their content knowledge. And so exposing them to researchers of color, women, within our museum community is critical to their development of their identity, and we are publishing the research of those findings, and that connects very deeply into expanding the museum's commitment to supporting the education and careers of young people of color and women in certain areas of science that they are underrepresented. So that's a pipeline that we're very explicit about at the museum starting in 6th grade. And so we are now embedded in the public school system.
Listen, because most people here are Europeans. What is 6th grade in the US? What age?
Do
you know?
11, 12,
Okay.
yeah?
Because sometimes those things are very different.
Thank you. So much younger than we ever understood, right? So that by the time they're getting to age 13 or 14, that is when a significant amount of population does not pursue science or even their science knowledge. So that's the point of intervention. And the points about employment are very key. Our primary focus is on diversifying staff at the upper management and curatorial ranks, and that's a major focus for us as well. But I think the thing that maybe I can contribute to the panel is addressing the issue of the representation of culture in our museum. So the American Museum of Natural History has biology, physical sciences, ethnographic, and archaeological work. And we have people's halls. We have halls of people still in our halls. And so what we have done is try to build our institutional capacity by annotating exhibits, beginning with Old New York, the Stuyvesant story of the selling of Manhattan. And we covered the glass, I've been thinking about your piece, with annotations to not erase the history, but to be able to bring forward what we now know is untold in that story. And we worked there with the Lenape Native community that's in a diaspora now, but we are on ancestral lands there. That then built our capacity, which we did not have any. I want to be very clear. This is work that we had to do as an institution that was not just curatorial. And we've just renovated the Northwest Coast Hall. This is perhaps one of the most beautiful ethnographic halls in the world, designed by Franz Boas. And that hall has recently been reopened. We had a co-curator for the first time who was an indigenous curator, Hayups, from the Northwest. And we had 10 Native curators that joined our curator, which was a huge departure from past practice. The labeled copy, for example, has indigenous language in the first person, which also is very unusual for us. And the most important thing we did in listening to the communities was to communicate that these cultures are alive today. In the context of a natural history museum, it's very easy to interpret these cultures as gone. And so this has been a very profound experience for the organization. And now The question is, what's next? And we don't know. And this is not comfortable, I think, for natural history museums generally, to not have all of the authority. But this is work that we're learning to do. And so I wanted to share that, Gonzalo.
Okay, so we're going to continue with the next topic. I want to just summarize one of the things, especially that is being posed here, which is we have to face things that make us uncomfortable at the beginning, but we've seen the message that the end product makes these institutions really proud. You just said that about your halls, when you involve the native populations that we were displaying in those museums. And we heard the same thing yesterday from Kirk Johnson's when he went back to Alaska to rebury those skeletons that have been on display at the Smithsonian for a long time. And how that created a link between that community and a much stronger bond to then represent those cultures. So I think that stepping out of our comfort zone, and sometimes now we're going to touch the issue of what's going to happen with repatriation, right? At the beginning, there's opposition, there's no, but this is mine, but, you know, and sometimes this might end up in a much better place, right? Where everyone involved feels good. And when those communities in the end might say, look, we want you to represent us, right? Because we have trust, we have a partnership. So I know that's common. That's been very prominent in London with other, you know, museums, not necessarily natural history, but can we talk a little bit about that now?
Sure. Yeah. No, look, it's I mean, it's to date, most of the focus has been on human cultural artifacts. Obviously, it's Benin bronzes, it's Elgin marbles, all of that, and human remains are a very special case. You know, obviously, we have human remains, you have human remains, we all do, and I think most of us have mechanisms for working out how, when communities want those remains returned and appropriately treated, we can deal with that. So I think that case is okay. I think that leaves you the really interesting case of natural history collections generally. And those, I think, you know, like any museum, start from the collections. That's what defines us. And the natural history collections are really interesting because, of course, they're there not just for display and edification. They're there for the purposes of scientific research. And they've always, right back to, you know, we've had our collections since 1753. You've been here since 1771. Those collections have always had those dual purposes. And I think Bruno and I and various others have been doing quite a lot of thinking about this, because at one level you could take a view that says, we know that 90% of those collections are from the global south. We know that 90% of them are held in the global north. That's terrible, give them all back. What's striking is how remarkably few people come to you and say, please return these collections, because they know just how excruciatingly difficult and expensive it is to look after them. You know, so in a sense, and actually, had our forebears not collected and looked after them, we would not have that resource. And particularly, as you were saying, science moves on. We now have historical ancient DNA. We have genomic analysis. We have all of these techniques. We have finally, which we'll come on to, the application of data science to start doing with these things. So thank goodness we have that resource. And it always surprises me, by the way, how little overlap there is between our collections. Because on the whole, look at the history, countries collected from the parts of the globe over which they had influence. And so we have a lot of Africa, we have Southeast Asia, we have all the Darwin, a lot of the Darwin material. Bruno has a different collection, Peter has a different collection, and on it goes. Edwin has an even different collection. So actually, it is a single collection. And in a sense, if you want to think about that collection as a critical global resource, it is our window back into time. It's our one opportunity to answer really important questions about, you know, the obvious stuff. How has environmental change impacted life in the past? That's how we'll build the models for the future. Really interesting work that we've been working with a number of your institutions on to try and understand where COVID came from. So to do that, every single bat in every single museum collection has now been digitized. We're just starting to now go back and using those DNA techniques to actually test for COVID RNA in historic bat specimens. And that will finally give us, by the way, there is some, which is quite interesting. Not all COVID came from a lab somewhere, as far as we can tell. But that's beginning to give you the opportunity for the first time to understand the origins of a critical zoonotic disease that's made the jump. So there's really, it's a resource. Now, how do we deal with that? I think there's a model that we could move towards that says, if you like, the wealthier nations can take on the responsibility for looking after the physical collections in perpetuity. That's a big commitment. We all know how expensive it is to look after these collections, how difficult it is. to build the cryogenic frozen stores, to keep the spirit collections. They're not cheap. But we have to make it available to everybody who wants it. And that's where I think the best model is through digitization rather than physical transfer. Again, just to give you one example, we're doing some really interesting work with the Singapore government right now. Now, to be fair, they approached us and they said, look, we've got the last 20 years. You've got most of the previous 300. Can we digitize every single Singapore specimen across all taxonomic groups? So take a place-based approach, understand through time for at least 300 years, across all taxonomic groups. Let's build the picture and let's do some research. And then we'll understand how has the ecology evolved as that area has gone through urbanization. You can also do really cool stuff like use ancient DNA samples on historic specimens we think are extinct and then go and use environmental DNA to see if they're still out there now. So there's just extraordinary work you can do that will make those collections visible and support exhibitions and support touring, but actually without having to physically move these collections all around the world, which I think will be unrealistic. So for me, I think that's probably the model we need to move towards, an obligation on us to say, we'll carry the cost. Of course, if you really want them back, we can have that conversation, but almost nobody comes to me and say, can you physically return a large collection? What they do come is say, make them available, make them visible for both science and edification. So that might be the kind of model we should explore. And I'd love to hear colleagues' thoughts on that. I know we've discussed it a bit.
How about the AMNH?
Yeah.
Well, I think the large-scale questions about how to know what we have from all dimensions, know it from a curatorial perspective and academic discipline perspective, but also from a cultural perspective, and as well as making those collections accessible, developing some practices around who has access to sample and other things. In the U.S. context, we have been under, for 30 years, of a national law that requires us to inventory all the material. And that was a very important development. But the strategy primarily was slow because of the resource required and because many of us didn't have the staff to do that work. But that has resulted in significant repatriation, and there's a hierarchy, human remains, associated objects with grave material, and then the cultural objects that you've referred to, which is probably the hardest territory, I agree. But we're still very much in the human remains question, and I would say that those conversations are very active, and the associated objects become among the most difficult to discuss, to learn about. There were objects in the Northwest Coast Gallery that were on display up until weeks before opening, because we didn't actually understand nor had learned from the nations how they associated those objects with human remains. So this learning is very current, and that's in some case in the US example, but many of those nations were from Canada. So the issue of international repatriation, I think, is very much upon us. We've proceeded to repatriate to Mexico and Canada and New Zealand, but I think that there's a quickening of that inquiry. And many of those communities come, as you've said, and say, we must sort of grieve together about the history. We want those stories told about the violence and other colonial practices. But we do wish to acknowledge that we recognize and appreciate the museum's care, because given the fate of those cultures, if we hadn't had the material, it may not have been lost forever. But I will say that we're spending a lot of time making 3D replicas of materials, having exchange of materials and each of those relationships we are taking a lot of time with. And so I think operating at multiple scales of strategies is something perhaps you'll hear from the panel, that it's very much intergovernmental, interrelational, but it's also about systems and professional development.
Completely agree with that.
Yeah.
And the other thing, of course, we all miss is you can't operate in isolation of other countries. So, for example, if you take about so we recently returned 119 skeletons to New Zealand.
Right.
3 Maori, but actually 116 were Moriori.
Yeah.
Which was it's only recently, I think, since really only in the last 15 years has even had a legal separate designation. New Zealand was thought to be an extinct tribe. It turns out there are a few survivors who understandably are very passionate about the return, and they had almost no remains.
Yeah.
You know, and actually it was a very interesting conversation. So on
yeah.
the one hand, you know, grateful these remains still exist and somebody looked after them, but very clear, can we have them back so
Yeah.
we can appropriately treat them? But so I think you're spot on that human remains at this point. I think the cultural artifacts overlap is really interesting.
I do too.
Yeah.
It, only because this is a convening of museums, international museums, I think for our institution, the establishment of the Te Papa Museum in New Zealand, which had co-governance between the Indigenous and the national government, was a key moment in our ability to affect a very deep long-term relationship for the transfer of material. So I think this return issue has so many dimensions that are very interesting to reflect on what makes possible strong repatriations, deep ones.
Yeah. But equally, Te Papa, having figured out how to do it for the US, is going to do it everywhere.
Say it again.
I was saying Te Papa will
Yes.
say, fine, we've worked an amazing, AMNH sorted, they'll go around every museum in the world now with the same approach. So
Well, everyone has to return Maori skeletons to New Zealand. That's no.
that's that.
Bruno.
As according to the moderators, that's
it
policy
is the way it
for
is.
all of us.
That's that.
We did it already. Actually, you are right. There are three categories of things that we have in our museum. There are cultural objects, I will let them apart. We have human remains, and we have ordinary natural history artifacts, or insects or snakes or whatever.
Yeah.
Regarding human remains in Paris, we have, just for regarding skulls, we have 18,000 skulls in our collection. This was skulls from the 19th century, mostly, and the majority of them are from Europe. Yeah. It was a way to describe the diversity of humanity at this time. We are describing it now with DNA, but maybe in 100 years, our successor will say, what? They take DNA on populations? It's horrible. Why not? At this time, they just took skulls. So we have those skulls, and we have a very precise policy. As far as the skulls are identified, we know to who the skull belongs. As far as there are descent of this person or a particular historical context, we are ready to repatriate, of course, the human remains. But the problem is that we need a law from the French Assembly to repatriate the remains. And sometimes it's a complex story. You know the relationship, the difficult relationship between France and Algeria, for example, across history. 2 years ago, the President of the Republic asked me to repatriate to Algeria a certain number of skulls that was taken during the 19th century, during the war of colonization of Algeria. So we set a Franco-Algerian commission, perfect scientists. They did a very nice job from archives, from everything, and they listed 24 skulls from the 19th century coming from Algeria. And we tell to the politicians, both side politicians, that among them, it's not only resistance against the French army, but also people from Algeria fighting for and not against the French army. But they decided to repatriate all the skulls. And last week, we had a paper in the New York Times telling what some of the skulls, which are now buried in the square of martyr of resistance against French army in the 19th century, are not resistant, actually. So we did the job, and finally, this ends by a mistake from politicians on both sides. So it's always very tricky. Yeah. Always very tricky with just very difficult situation that we have to look at one by one. I have another story, if I can, about a king in Madagascar, Tawara king. And the story is very nice because we have been contacted by Madagascar official authorities, by the family, the descent of a king. The skull is in the collection, might be in the collection of the museum, and the rest of the body is buried in Madagascar. So we analyzed the archives, and we said, well, there are 4 candidates to be the skull of a king. And we look at them, we discard 2 of the skulls, it rested 2 of them, and we started to do DNA analysis on the skull and on the rest of the body, the postcranial remains. Unfortunately, it was impossible to have DNA from the postcranial remains, so we cannot. But the job was done with the family, with the Madagascar authorities, with the French authorities, with the museums, and so we really did, for me, a very, very nice job in doing that. And so you see, it's always complex regarding human remains. Of course, we did that with we repatriate from New Zealand people, and we are able to do that, even if it's not fully legal, as we have not a law for that, but it's kind of a long-term deposit, if I can say. We found this way to do the things. And that's for human remains. For natural history standard objects, I think if we start to repatriate, it will soon be a problem, because where is the limit? Are we allowed in Paris to have specimens coming from Corsica or Brittany, or from England? Why? And in this case, we are just allowed to have specimens coming from the Jardin des Plantes in the middle of Paris. So it's an endless process. So we have to find another solution. And the solutions that you tell is to take the responsibility of building collaboration with other countries, to promoting the things. And I have an example. We did that with Colombia for an herbarium. We have a lot of herbarium sheet or plates, I don't know, sheets is correct in English? Yeah. Sheets in our collections coming from Colombia. In Bogota, in Colombia, you have also an herbarium, a smaller one, and we decided to complete the herbarium all together in making field trips, in making numerical object twins of this herbarium that we can share and put all the things together. And I think it's a good model to do the things together. Yesterday we spoke a little bit after the talk from Kirk about kind of international museum, not only national, but kind of international networks of museums, not only a network, kind of new way of thinking what could be an international museums. And I think we are ready to do that, taking the responsibility of organizing more or less that in contact with other countries. And as far as it's possible, we are doing the job. Last year, we did a very small museum. It's about 2 times the size of this room in Comores. You know, the small island in the Madagascar Strait, in the Mozambique Strait, that were French sometimes, and now they are independent. And we helped them to build a small museum around the coelacanth and all the coelacanth story and so on. So it's really possible. And I think we have good tracks to do that, but we have to clearly separate cultural objects, human remains, and other objects. Otherwise, it will be a complete mess.
There are a lot of really good points, and there are a couple ones that I would like to summarize. One is use new technologies for sharing objects, which will be shared with the original places of those natural history museums. Obviously, the human remains and cultural remains, this is something that will continue evolving, and we will have to, probably just do whatever the people of origins of those things, like we would like them to be respectful with our ancestors, for example.
For human remains, it's really, really tricky because it can be instrumentalized by other people.
It can be very political.
It can be a political group within a country that asks you, but the government is not happy with that. And so it's always a nightmare.
And also, all of us are biologists, and we are dealing with some of those aspects that are a little bit outside of our area of comfort, I would say. And then the other options are contributing to these international collaborations, which in modern collections now, many countries, they ask you to leave vouchers behind, right? They'll give you permits to collect there, but you need to leave a synthetic collection behind. Return types, I have to return types to Paris because I described new species from New Caledonia, right? So the rules now are very clear.
Yeah.
But we're going back to the rules before, I think it's important. And we've seen some solutions. One that we are practicing is, now I have a fund that whenever a Brazilian or an Argentinian student tells me, oh, you have the types for these groups, like, we pay for your visit. And I think that there are other formulas also, because sometimes you cannot study an object with a 3-dimensional projection. We know we need to see the specimens. We might need to dissect the specimens. So I think that another way of thinking forward might be developing certain. Yeah.
No, I think that's right. But I just think, and we had this debate, a group of us a while back. I think there's a danger that if we wait too long, we'll be on the back foot in this debate. You could make it. If I talk to my museum colleagues who at the British Museum or the V&A, they very much feel
We're behind.
we're behind.
Yeah.
I think on human remains, absolutely hear all of the complexities, the nuances, the difficulty finding that. But I think on the whole, we're feeling our way through that. I think on human culture and artifacts, it's clear that the museum world is behind. And I think if we are not careful, I think if we don't come forward with some positive, proactive suggestions of the kind of ones you're describing, I think there's a risk we'll be behind on biological specimens or even geological specimens. And I think that could be very unfortunate. So I think it's quite important that we do collectively as an international collection of museums almost put forward our thesis about what we think the right approach is.
We need to be very proactive.
Yeah.
I think, in Europe, because you have, well, now not you, sorry, but the rest of Europe now, when they have the synthesis program. Right?
The UK is still part of Europe.
No, but
No, I know.
Synthesis
Exactly.
invites, students
Yeah.
from one country
Totally.
to go to another EU country.
Totally.
Let's use those opportunities to bring people to visit also the specimens from the countries of origin, for example, right? I mean, these types of proactive things will show that we want to continue being the stewards of these international collections, but we recognize that we have to bear some of the cost of visiting. And there's a lot of the politics involved, as you said, not only with human remains. This is the logo of the MCC, a very unfortunate logo. It's a Kronosaurus from Queensland, Australia, which was acquired a long time ago in a transaction that, the family of the land, they visited the MCC. They're very happy that it's on display there. But a few months ago, I was contacted by a journalist from Australia saying, this is the holotype of the Queensland, state fossil. Would you return it? Right, and it was quite aggressive. I said, well, look, let me look into the origins of these things. Turns out during this process, he already published the MCC will not return it, right? That specimen is as big as this hall. I mean, it will just break down. And actually, the Queensland scientists told her, no, we don't want that specimen returned. The MCC has already sent 2 casts of the holotype to the Queensland Museum. We'd like our government to invest more in looking for more specimens of that fossil, right? So sometimes there's the press involved, and scientists and press and politicians have very different views about these aspects, right?
I have two very short stories. First story, I know that at the Smithsonian, there is the diamond of Louis XIV, the original one. I asked to Gurr to return it to France, he refused. I didn't insist.
I think Gonzalo, excuse me.
I have another story with Edwin. Where is Edwin? I don't know. Here he is. Edwin, when during the revolution time in France, the French armies went to Netherlands, and they took the big skull of the big animal of Maastricht, a mosasaur. It's still in the collection in France. But you see, because in Europe, we have a lot of wars, we pick up things everywhere. And so it's complex. In addition, the boundaries move. For example, if you look in the Alps were not fully French at certain time in the history. There were no Italian neither, because Italy didn't exist at this time. It was the kingdom of Piedmont, Savoie. So the specimens from there, they belong to who? So the president in France said that within Europe, we have not to repatriate. The history is just too complex, the Europe, including England.
Including England, that's right. We'll do some swaps, it'll be fun.
Okay, in a large sense, we have not to repatriate because the history is just too intricate and too complex, and we pick up, we steal things everywhere, we return some, we didn't after. We have originals of the negotiation after the Vienna Treaty, after Napoleon time. Because during the revolution and Napoleon wars, France just kept a lot of specimens from everywhere in Europe. It was terrible. But during the Vienna Congress, they did list. This one we can repatriate, this one not. It was kind of negotiation between the different countries at this time. And it's a very interesting model of negotiation after a critical time, a very long critical time. And it was really line by line, object per object, what could be sent back to the original place or not.
I only wanted to add that I think that the relationship between this work, which is deep scientific work, collaborative work, academic work, the relationship between that work and the public's expectation when they come in the door is also a bridging question, I think, for many of us. As this work quickens, what is the pace of the public reveal, the public understanding of the process that we're in, because it's not done. And I think that is something, at least at the museum where I work in New York, we are not so comfortable telling stories that we don't know the end. And I think this is an essential challenge in bridging the public obligation of our museums with our academic and international collaboration. So I just wanted to.
Lisa, have you seen any backlash either from the public or from certain political groups to your representation of the Northwest galleries? I mean, has it been universally welcomed, or has there been hostility? Or
Well, I think universally touted, most essentially by the communities that we worked with.
yeah,
But even at opening some of those communities, so just to put a very specific point on it, thank you for the question, the difference between possession and ownership became a conversation on the day of opening. Even over 10 years of building relationships, this question of
wow,
time, and that while we may possess these objects, the ownership is understood to be within the source communities, and that is a belief, sacred belief. So that was a surprise, that this was something that for those communities they wanted to bring that up, even at the success of the.
opening.
So I think
Interesting.
there's nothing overly tidy about this work, I think. I think that many of our trustees, so we are a private nonprofit governed by a board of trustees, non-governmental. I think some of our donors and communities felt that some of the label copy may have been overly woke in the sense of telling stories of colonization and how these objects were received. And that was not fully comfortable. The pandemic exacerbated that because the work was going on when people were not able to see the work in progress. But I think people have come to understand that it is an authentic presentation, but very, very different than any other hall that we've done.
Interesting.
And we don't know where it takes us next, which is, I think, surprising to us that we don't have a map yet of the.
Yeah, you have not the end of a story.
Great,
Don't
yeah.
have the end of the story.
Good, looking forward to coming
And the
and seeing
world
it.
is changing, right? And we're all becoming
Yes.
much more empathetic with everybody else, right? I
Yeah.
mean, and I think that's very important. You know, in the US, a few times now, I hear people acknowledging that we're standing on the land of the people who lived there before
Yeah.
Europeans, right? In New Zealand now, absolutely every official thing begins with a Maori
land
text and recognizing the land where people stand, right? And in Australia is getting there also, right? I know that's not for Europe because Europe, it is what it is. You know, some European colleague asked me, yeah, this American asked me, do you recognize the land of your ancestors who was there before? It's like, yeah, not the case. But that's why the mentality is very
let's be
different.
clear. I mean, you know, Peter, Neanderthals, presumably. Yeah, there you go. That's right. I think there you go. That's right.
But we share DNA with them. Anyway, I think this is a very, very interesting panel. We could talk for hours. And I think that the more we have this conversation, actually, the more we feel that we want to do good.
Yes.
We want to really remediate some of these things from the past. So I think that this is something we will continue talking about. And thank you so much for presenting here. And thank you. I want to recognize also Rafa, and Borja, and the rest of the team for organizing this event, for putting together this amazing group of people from the museum and from other museums as well. So
Well done.
No question.
Oh, no questions, right? Because we have another. These were shorter panels. Sorry.
Okay.
Right, no
Do we
problem.
have time for one question?
5
Probably
minutes?
not, because
Oh.
we need to.
Okay. So I think we're about to start. with this session on communication. My name is Luis Quevedo. I come from FECYT, which is the Spanish Foundation for Science and Technology, part of the Ministry of Science. I want to thank Rafa and Borja for inviting me today. This is a real honor. The roundtable, Communicating Natural Science, the idea, we're starting 5 minutes late, but that's fine. We're going to keep some 15 minutes, if you like, for Q&A, for questions from the public. We will have Xiomara right there. She's got the mic. Please, we're streaming, so if you can be mindful of waiting for the mic to get to you before speaking, that would be amazing. So how about we do something? I know you probably know these persons very well, but just for the streaming guys, let's have a quick round of introduction. Who we have on our panel, their background, and the institution they are representing today. And I would love to start by Katrin Vohland from the Naturhistorisches Museum at Vienna.
Hi.
Welcome. Katrin, could you tell us a little bit about your background and your institution?
Well, I'm a biologist from my formation. I studied biology. I did a PhD thesis on the speciation of millipedes together with the Max Planck Institute at the National Institute for the Amazon Research in Manaus. So I stayed years in Brazil. Well, I worked in different institutions because as a biologist, you have not such a clear career as, for instance, working in a bakery. So I worked for the University of Potsdam. I worked for the Potsdam developed in one place science policy interface. So we developed a network bringing together different disciplines related to biodiversity research, which is not only taxonomy and ecology, but you also have to deal with values and with economy. And I also built up citizen science. In Germany, we had the platform, but I also am co-founder of the European Citizen Science Association, and we had a cross-action on citizen science. So those are my two key points, also for science communication. And since 2 years, I'm now in Vienna, in the Naturhistorisches Museum of Vienna, which is a very special museum because it's linking humanities and natural sciences in one place. And personally, I think it's the most beautiful museum in Europe, so you may come. So there's a very close link between the ceilings in the museum and the objects you found in the bottom. So you walk through the evolution, you walk through all the minerals, you come to the organic part of life, you walk through all the animal kingdoms, starting with the minor animals, if you say so, like corals, and you come to the insects, to the fishes, and finally you come to the apes. And the interesting thing is, this museum is not as old as this one. As I said, I'm very impressed by the Age of You Museum, but it was built in a very Catholic period. But already in that time, the Habsburg Empire invested in science and adapted the ideas of Darwin. So this is really built as an evolutionary museum. You walk with the objects and with the ceilings and through the history of evolution. So about science communication and science from the first minute as a background.
All right, thank you very much. Next up, Julian Siggers from the Peel Museum in Chicago.
No.
Welcome. Oh, sorry.
Nice.
Sure?
Koen.
Okay. My bad. I had my notes were terrible. Ken Martens from the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences. I deeply apologize.
You are forgiven.
Sorry. I missed the email apparently.
I am Koen Martens from Brussels, Belgium. I'm not from Chicago. I am the head of research of the Natural History Institute in Brussels. So I'm not the general director. I represent the general director, Patricia Suppli, who brings her congratulations to the Madrid Museum, Rafa, for 250 years of existence. We were already proud a couple of years ago with 175 years. Well, there is always a bigger fish. So I am the head of research. We have about 400 people in the institute, of which there are 170 researchers. That's everybody included, also short-term contracts. I am personally an evolutionary biologist with my roots in taxonomy. My main job in the institute is actually to follow up and to make now a new research strategy, because that's something that Rafa, when he was member of the visitation committee in 2014, made one of the recommendations. you've been here for 170 years and you don't have a research strategy. Get on with it. So this is where I got the nomination as head of research. My background is basically the Institute of Natural Sciences. I've been there basically since the 14th century. That's how it feels. All my career, with a short break in when I was professor in Amsterdam for a short time. I'm studying evolutionary biology in freshwater. Ostracods is my group. Some of you must know these little creatures, little microcrustaceans. And I am happy to be here.
Thank you. We too, and apologies again.
You're the guy from Portugal, aren't you?
On the weekend, yeah. And now I'm positive our next guest is Brigitte Franzen.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
You're right.
So good. From the Senckenberg Museum at Frankfurt.
Yes, hello. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation. And also congratulations from our side, from Senckenberg, to this wonderful institution here. We are almost as old as you are. The museum in Frankfurt is 200 years old. We celebrated our birthday last year. Senckenberg as a whole research institution was founded in 1817. And we are really proud because one of the idea givers for the institution was Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who made the people in Frankfurt, the citizens in Frankfurt, the rich citizens in Frankfurt, in conceiving such a research society in the early 19th century. And from the beginning on, there was the idea of having a museum. And he also conceived the name, not speaking of a natural history museum, but speaking of a nature museum, Naturmuseum. That's our title. And for us and for me, this is really an important detail. Because all what we do in the museum has also to do with, of course, visual culture or with culture in general, with our view, scientifically, research-wise, on nature. So Naturmuseum, for me, is the ideal title for such an institution. And I'm somehow a bohemian in this round because I'm not a natural scientist, I'm not a natural historian, maybe partly, I'm also a natural historian, but I'm a trained art historian, a museologist, a cultural researcher. So it's a bit unusual maybe to come into this post. The Senckenberg Institution is a big research institution with more than 850 people working there, 300 researchers, and I'm representing the Frankfurt Museum with around 100 people working there. Also scientists, of course, exhibition curators, and also, of course, curators of collections who are part of the Frankfurt Research Institute. The museum is also part of the Frankfurt Research Institute. Maybe that's for now.
All right, thank you very much. So let me start by your first question. We are celebrating 250 years here. Your institutions have long histories as well. And museums in general, not only natural history museums, have undergone major transformations since the collection center of yesteryear, I guess, to the more experience-prone of nowadays. How are you engaging with that transformation? What shape should natural history museums adopt today?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as you said, museums have this mission, like we discussed already yesterday. So we have to care for the collections, we do research, and we have a link to communication. With regard to this transformation or transition, we also frame our communication within the broad idea of open science. So if you also look at the pillars of open science of the European Commission and their strategy, science communication plays a major role. And your science communication is not only communication with the public, science communication already starts as a scientific process, because if you don't communicate something, nobody can prove what you've done. So it's already intrinsically part of science. And I think it's important that we have this in our mind. The idea of open science now of the European Commission, and I think it's not only the Commission, but it's a broad movement, is to really open the scientific process towards the scientific world, but also increasingly to the public, to understand the processes, to get the data, to get all this information. So we developed this in the museum, an open science strategy, which comprises how we deal with our collections, that we increasingly also try what we already discussed yesterday to implement this FAIR criteria, that we link up to the DISCO project, that synthesis was also mentioned. It's very important, also capacity building project, not only for us, but for the whole community. So science communication starts with our collections and with our science. What we also would like to achieve is not only some topical insights, that we understand better nature and also the human nature links, but we also would like that the scientific process itself is better understood. So open science gives some opportunity, because I think if you talk about skepticism and all these things, it's also because it's not always transparent what science is. Science is always searching for the truth, but science, also the different disciplines have different ideas what is good practice and apply different methods. And I think that is something we need to understand. If you go back, for instance, for this COVID pandemic, in the first line, we only had virological persons being around and telling us what's the genetic code of the virus. It was extremely fast openly. We have all these vaccinations. Okay, later, then also psychologists came into, and the politician scientists and the economists. So all science communication, and we would like to make clear this is a process also to discuss values. Because there's some link between the scientific knowledge and different disciplines. And then science communication is also to invite the public to discuss about values and to make this extremely transparent. And I think parts of the frustration we experience also in front of our museum, we have these demonstrations, is that we don't openly discuss also the underlying value systems and all the different scientific disciplines. So for me and us, science communication goes really deep into the own understanding what we think is science, what is scientific knowledge, what is a scientific process. So, and the open science movement, the idea to include citizens into scientific processes, also all these options to digitize the collections and the methodologies, the codes, also put how you interpret the data on GitHub with the computer programs, that also helps to make the scientific process transparent. So we would, in one sentence perhaps, foster the topical knowledge on everything which is related to nature and evolution, and we also would like to make the scientific process transparent.
Can I ask you, before going
Sure.
on to Koen, are you successfully engaging the audience with this open science, with this, let's look under the hood of how the scientific process actually works? Because on the other hand, museums used to have a lot to do with, we have a lot of children, school children now visiting, doing the regular visits, if you will. How is it going with the new open science movement?
Super interesting question. Also, this new metrics or altmetrics, or how to measure success, is part of is one of the pillars, and it's one thing we are currently discussing. Normally, if you judge science, you count the money people get for the third-party projects, and you count the papers, and perhaps you count how many people read the paper. So, if you would like to assess how successful this open science strategy is, you need a set of tools. You go into the social sciences, and it's sometimes always, it's not so easy to make this close link. If you make a measure, then you have a direct output. If you would like to measure changes in the perception of the population or of a specific group, it's not so easy to assign a specific outcome to a specific option. So what we intend to do is to increase our the research also together with other institutes, how learning functions, for instance, in the museum. So if we offer more open scientific processes, if we offer options for citizen science, we try to have focus groups, for questionnaires, invite also social scientists to understand what the people really learn. We have, as you said, thousands of school kids going into the museum. I don't know what they do have from it. I think it was framed very nicely yesterday. Parents go with their kids, and then the kids go also with their kids. And we also would like to have the persons in between, and I would like to know what the kids get out of it. So we are also running programs with very small kids, and we try to observe them with persons who understand how learning functions and how we can foster it. But it's not easy to measure, to be honest. Yeah.
Easy, no? Thank you very much. Koen, how are you doing in Brussels?
Yeah, well, so you're quite right in the fact that museums have to evolve together with society. And although we don't use the name as such, we try to be open museum. Not only open science, but open museum, which means that you open also the collections. We have visits behind the curtains, as they say. We have all sorts of initiatives to bring school children actively working. We have paleo labs, that they learn that sort of thing. We have the open science as well, but maybe we can postpone that to a bit later. What I would like to stress, because there are things that we have done, that we're doing, that all museums are doing, in opening up towards the public much more than before, is that we have a relatively large group of people that are dealing with science policy interface. So it's just one aspect, but we are very much linked to the federal government of Belgium. Belgium is a very complicated country. We have a federal government, we have a Flemish government, we have a Brussels government, we have a Wallonian government, we have all sorts of intermediate governments, and each has their own competences, as we call them. So we try to concentrate on federal competences because we are basically not allowed to work on things which are regional competences. And so we have installed this science policy interface, which deals mostly with biodiversity and which brings into contact scientists and politicians. That's the theory, which mostly works, but of course they also do other things. They liaise with international organizations. We have, for example, the focal point of the biological convention. We have the focal point of, we represent the focal point of GBIF. We have the Belgian Biodiversity Platform. We have a large project which deals with, how do you call that, training people in Central Africa with regard to biodiversity aspects. We have the Alien Invasive Species Secretary for Europe. So basically we have a large component and a large investment in science policy interface. And it works relatively well. The idea is that scientists tell politicians what they would like to do. Politicians ask questions to scientists, and scientists have to reply to that. But it's varying. It's very varying in its success with reaching politicians, because we have a democracy. We have new governments every 4 years, different political parties, and they have all their own interests and their own priorities. Yeah. Right. But we decided that this would be one of the points that in which we would, as a museum, adapt to changing times. That was your question, right?
Yeah. It's very interesting. Do you circumscribe your advisory to things that are already at the museum, or do you field any kind of questions from the politicians?
Well, it goes mostly through we have an organization called Belgian Science Policy, which is BELSPO, right. And they are the ones that are organizing a lot of the interface between, but mostly administratively, but also regarding calls for projects. Right. And so we are advising then to BELSPO what would be at that moment the on demand from the questions from the scientists, right. But also through different contexts, what are the political questions that need to be addressed by scientific research. Right. But I say this is only one part. I'm just highlighting this part. Right, we also have done things about opening collections, the museum stuff. We have something which is called, which is a truck Experilab. It's a truck, and we go. It's a laboratory inside, and we go from school to school, so that people, young kids, can actually, right. From a very young age, start to see what does a laboratory look like, what's a microscope. They can actually do small experiments, so like going outside of the walls as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Brigitte.
Yes, it's really an interesting question, and I would like to come from a different perspective, because I think we also have to speak about decanonization of the museum. This is something which in art museums and also anthropological museums is discussed very widely. I didn't hear so much about it in the natural history museums field so far, because for me, our work is very much linked and influenced by the history of the place and the space where we are, the history of the collections also. It's international, of course, that's the main perspective, but it's also about the genius of the place. And this differs from city to city, from museum to museum. And this is something which is really interesting in terms of connecting to the public. What Lisa said before, I think from the New York perspective, links a little bit to this idea, I think also, in the former panel. And what I also find really important in this round of natural history museums is, of course, the collections are the base and it's the core of what's defining the museum and what's giving us all the, let's say, material where we can do exhibitions of. And all what we do in exhibitions is research-driven, it's knowledge-based, people trust in us, that's really an absolute a big favor for us as a common ground of society. So for me, the museum is a holistic space, but it's also for me very important to understand exhibitions not just as an outcome of research, not a process that follows the research, but as something which is integrated into research. For example, we just opened an exhibition on paleoclimate research. And from the beginning on, the exhibition was part of the process of the research protocol, so to speak. So it was an integral part. I think nothing's functioning now.
It's not working?
I'm trying to speak loud. The exhibition didn't start after the research process ended. It was an integral part from the beginning on. And this is how we define exhibition making in Frankfurt. Also in a transdisciplinary way, also not only in the way how we contact the public, but also in the way how we conceive our teams. I always try to have a team with 2 curators, and the best is to have somebody from the cultural sciences as well as from the natural sciences. So we did for the climate exhibition we just opened. And this is something really important to conceive and to understand exhibitions also as research projects. That's something I would love to discuss further. Yeah.
Brigitte, could you expand a little bit on this? Because I find this fascinating, never thought of it. What were the specific, the part of the communication challenges, if you will, of having that in mind from moment zero in research?
Yeah, it means that you do not know what you do from the beginning. It's an experimental process, right. Also, like in experimental physics. You have a laboratory situation when you conceive an exhibition, right? And you only know the outcome maybe if you have a period of, let's say, 2 years to study it. What you do, then you know the outcome maybe a year before installing the exhibition, maybe right. Not even a year, maybe right. Even 1.5 years only. So you know, it's a process you are working on, and it has to do also with visualization, of course. Mm-hmm. It's about pictures, and pictures. We as human beings are picture driven. Right. So this is the tool of understanding through cultures, over cultures, as a transcultural process also.
Oh, interesting. By the way, if anyone has, a burning question and don't want to wait for the Q&A, please go ahead and raise your hand, and we can accommodate you. So Katrin mentioned the open science movement within the European Union. Not only that, there's also the new European Bauhaus, which kind of tries to foster, right, the meeting of art and sciences and how we can leverage both to better communicate and foster a better European society. How are you approaching that? Are you using the artistic side on your museums, or this new European Bauhaus? Are you fostering any specific project?
Which one?
Is anyone doing it? You do it. Please, Brigitte, go ahead.
You should go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's also something, of course, I bring in with my experience in the art field, having done 100 exhibitions in my career. But the crucial thing for me and for us in the Senckenberg Museum in Frankfurt is to integrate artists as designers, as experimentally thinking people who have their own approach, but also who get along with the researchers, of course, because they are as well trained in exploring unknown fields and defining ideas. So what we recently started is asking artists to act as designers in our museum. So it's not about displaying just paintings or sculptures between dinosaurs. That's not the way to do it. Artists are experts in their fields and in the fields of visualization, and this is really interesting to integrate them in this way. For example, they designed our research lab. A group of artists from the region designed the research lab we did, and they did it absolutely differently from exhibition designers. But I would not say that you should do only projects with artists. That's also probably not the way to do it. But a mixture is interesting, and this inspires the projects in between also. The artists are inspiring the designers also, the traditional exhibition designers, and vice versa. So this is an interesting impact then also.
Right.
We will open we renovate one of our rooms. And it's a small project, but it's a nice project with some design students, because they have been asked how the world would have been developed without eukaryotes. Yeah, so there are so-called gabibionta, which are structures which look like multicellular, but which are not cells. So this students are asked how they would imagine a world like this, and then there was a small competition, and we can also show something like this. We have in the museum Rasa New Science Communication Center, the so-called DEC 50, and we have done it together with Ars Electronica. Perhaps you know this. This is a very fancy museum in Linz, and they reflect the impact that the digital world has on ourselves and our self-perception and everything. So they are also experts in how to design these things. But arts is not only exhibition. So arts can to play around with our digital representation of objects, can play around with the music, can play around with. There are also archives of tones, of bird singing and whatever. So arts is a very broad field and it's very difficult to judge, I also have to say. That's also something whom you live in, how do we get let out, because we have every second day a question of any artist who or she would like to do something with us. And it's despite we don't have too much space for this, it's also not so easy to decide, because in fact I would like we have a message, we have an idea, we have objects, and then to invite the artist. So it's not an established process at the moment in our house.
I find the question particularly interesting because I've always seen a very big link between artists and scientists. They are both creative people. And they have just different means to express it. This being said, most of our scientists that I know of have as a hobby art, either music or writing or painting. So the link is there. Another link that I can say is that most, if not all, classical taxonomists should be seen as artists because they illustrate a lot of animals, and some of these plates that they produce could actually go straight on the wall, and some do. Yeah. But this being said, no, we do not do what you asked. We do not have such initiatives. We have a number of very nice paintings of when the The iguanodons were found, you know, this is the pride and joy of our museum, is that flock of iguanodon fossils, the dinosaurs. And so they were found somewhere in the 1850s, and so there's a very nice series of paintings that, but the actual initiative to link arts and science, we do not. The Africa Museum in Tervuren, which is about 15 kilometers from us, we consider it our not-so-digital twin, is actually doing that all the time, because they have a series of research groups which involves music, which involves wood analysis in order to analyze the statues and so on. And of course, they invite a lot of contemporary African artists to come and play, to come and display, and so on. So that museum for sure has that angle. We are one of 10 institutes that are federal institutes, and amongst them are 3 art museums. And so I can just assume that there have never been enough contacts between the directors of our museum and then the art museums to see if we could do something jointly, because obviously the possibilities are there.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe add something also, to add something, it's not at all new, because if you look around just only here in the room, you have art everywhere. So all of the natural history museums have also own art collections, and it's worth to discover it. Also from the scientific history point of view, from the view of the history of the institution itself. And also as a tool to approach the public. And it's often neglected, actually. It's somehow put aside, at least what I experience in Frankfurt. We had to really dig it out, and it's not at all sorted. The art collection is really hidden. So it's worth on looking at it closer. And if you look at the taxidermies, for example, those are artworks too.
Right.
It's
for sure.
It's taxonomy,
Absolutely.
but it's also artworks,
Absolutely.
and they're so intriguing by their aesthetics.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah, you're right. Let me get back with another question, though. But it's a tricky territory, because we can look at collections and the artistic side of those collections, and whether they are taking advantage of, whether we're using it in the proper way, or getting the most out of it or not. But also, there's a lot of, I think, experimentation, perhaps. A lot of works of, I'm bringing X artist, and then he or she is collaborating with somebody from the museum, and then something comes out of it. Is that, and sorry about the generalization, but is that something that you can safely, scientifically speaking, use to engage the public, or is it too much risk? Let me paint a little anecdote. Last week, I was visiting an exhibit in New York, which is done in collaboration with the Society for Neuroscience. And it's supposed to be about the brain and how a neuron works. And it was artistically and visually astounding, amazing, engaging, fascinating, really. Not so much the science. And perhaps because I used to deal in neuroscience, and so it was somewhat underwhelming. And I'm wondering, is that citizen that visited this exhibit going to go ahead and learn more neuroscience, or is he or she missing an opportunity to get to engage or know what you have in store in the museum? You know what I mean?
I think I do. I think for sure that there are ways that art can actually promote science. There is no doubt about it. I cannot just imagine another example at this moment, but there must be millions, really. So yes, I'm sure that there are possibilities. But there are also other possibilities. Art is not only visual; it can also be words. It can also be music, can also be poems. Yeah. And there are many books in which people have motivated people to actually start science.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think writers are still artists. I think we can agree on that. So it's just that, well, for example, we have a scientific publication unit, which is publishing some series of journals and books, but it's strictly for scientific public. We have analyzed a market for more popular works that we could, for example, publish. But the market is so full with commercial enterprises that if you can't link with one of them, you're actually not going to reach the public that you would like to reach. So for us, this is a means of maybe art, which is we decided not to endeavor in. And another thing is also that we have, unlike maybe other museums that we heard yesterday, that Kirk has no problem with money. We are suffering from severe budget cuts because we have several reorganizations of the Belgian state, and each time the federal level has less money. So we have severe budget cuts, which we try to compensate by having more income from ourselves, like museum income. We have a paying museum. People have to pay to come to our museum. Yeah. We have installed a research office to help our scientists to get more projects and so on. But another aspect is that we are very much focused on focusing, so that we actually do less. We have to do less because we have less money. So with less money, you cannot do the same things. And so there is very little room for new initiatives. And so, although every now and then the idea of arts, inviting an artist for something pops up, we just simply don't have the means for the moment. It's a sad message. It's not a positive message, but it's a reality. Yeah.
Right.
Perhaps another example, we just started a program which is called Vielfalt kennenlernen, to also get known to diversity. And for instance, we started this with butterflies. And there was some kind of science show, so you can learn something about butterflies, the distribution, the development. We just saw this nice drawings from Sibylla Merian on the metamorphosis, and there was a quiz, so people get activated. Then we have a part in the lab, so people can also use the binoculars and to see the butterflies, to see the structures, where the color is getting from. And then it's all in deck 50. There's also some kind of creative zone, where then there can be done some bricolage. I'm not sure whether it already gets at arts, but it's an area where you can experience some creativity, and you come down and you can also think about what you heard and write or draw something. And also for smaller kids, it's sometimes really relaxing to draw something. And we have also something other where you immediately have some little success. There are also a very large screen. And then, for instance, we have the ocean. You can invent an animal, or very good a fish, which is swimming in the ocean. You draw it, and it's scanned, and immediately you can see, and everybody else can see it on the screen. So it is something creative. It's a link to arts. It's perhaps not, you won't be able to sell it for $1 million like your drawings here. But this link is some kind of activation, because you immediately have the success. You see your own drawing or whatever you did there, and you can experience something. And it's linked to nature, and it's linked to what we would like to show, which is the diversity of the butterflies in this case.
Right. Let me ask you a related question. I think it's related to the arts. Let me ask you about new technologies such as the metaverse and VR, etc. One of the good things and the bad things about museums such as this is you get a common visit, right? Personally, and most digitalization so far, it's far from the real thing, from the experience. Do you see any promise in technologies of VR, immersive reality, etc., to sort of bring your museum elsewhere to more people? Brigitte?
Yes, of course, it's an important tool. I mean, but it's always both, Museums are about authenticity, and this is our big advantage also. I mean, you hear it always. It sounds maybe a bit dull, or I don't know, but it's about authenticity of the objects. That's for sure, and this is a really big advantage. But then digitization comes into play, and this is absolutely interesting. And I think it's the same for many museums that COVID made us think about this even better and more than ever before. It came out that we need not only digital strategies, but also people to do it. So we developed certain projects, of course, very easygoing, because we have very smart people in the team who can do it just instantaneously. We developed, for example, a very nice series called Museum at Kinderzimmer, which means a museum in the children's room. And it was followed by something which is called Museum in the living room for the adults. And this became viral, and people loved it so much. But digital strategy means much more. Like Städel Museum, for example, does it in Frankfurt with the digitorials to prepare exhibition visits, or also to after a visit to go deeper into a subject. But that needs manpower and womanpower, and this is something which is often overseen because everybody speaks about digitization, but you need to have experts in this also, and it's often a lack of money to have this. So, and actually, one sentence also about this digital-only myth. For me, it's very much a myth because, of course, there is new generations who are very adapted to those methods and forms and things, and to digitization as such. But for them, it's also quite normal. And I always experience it that the younger people also love very much the situation in a museum to get into contact with scientists, with original objects, and all that. So it's a mixture already of different perceptions and tools and measures of expression. Right. And it's quite natural. And what I find really interesting also, of course, are exhibition projects who deal with augmented reality. So, for example, this is also where the EU, for example, comes into play with projects. We are working together with the Wiesbaden University on a project about HoloLenses, where you could get informations in walking through the museum through certain lenses while you are experiencing authentic objects and getting more information digitally. So we are really on the track, but it takes time and it costs money, and it has to be conceived properly because, of course, we are an authentic place. This is important.
There is no escaping the evolving technology, of course. That's quite clear. The question is only what do you do with it? Right. And so it's true that certain age class of youngsters is mostly interested in anything to do with social media, and you can fill books with what I don't know about social media, but we have a communication service who is very well versed in these things. But I think you should try. Okay, and during COVID, we had some virtual tours that we put on the internet, which is that was a good thing at that moment because they were not allowed to come. And so we were doing our duty because our motto is bringing nature into everybody's life. So we were bringing nature into everybody's life at home because they couldn't come. But for the rest, I think you should try not to please people outside of your walls too much. You have to try to use these media to bring them inside your museum. And there are ways to do that, but yeah. And one way is, I mean, you will maybe be surprised because it's not something that we expected. Patricia, who is now our general director, some years ago was director of the supporting services, and she was in charge of the people that needed to supervise this place, you know, to make that kids would not climb on the on the dinosaurs and so on. And she was contacted by a company, I think a Dutch company, who offered that we could have some robots as supervisors of this place, some small robots that would look around and look for security. For example, with artificial intelligence, they can be trained that a door that should be closed, they can see it's open, that's not okay. They can answer simple questions to people. And we thought that would be actually a fantastic thing because people would come to the museum, not for the museum anymore, but also for the robots. You know, so any means is valid. Right. As you can see, our politicians blocked it. They said they couldn't guarantee the security, but afterwards they had other reasons, so it never materialized. But I thought it was an excellent experiment. It could have been an excellent experiment, not to replace the human people, because of course unions could then oppose this idea, but absolutely not. We had no intention of firing people, only to help them with some tasks that otherwise could be done by artificial intelligence. But that's just one way. But so the message I would like to convey is that if use all means that possible, and certainly the social media, which are the most important ones for a certain age class. I have hundreds of sons, well, 3 actually, but when they were growing up, it felt like hundreds of them. And they went through all of these phases. Yeah, like when the youngest one was 15, I said, you know, just testing. We have put something on Facebook of the museum. Did you see that? I said, oh, Facebook is for old people. Yeah. I'm not going to Facebook. So you really have to. Your communication service really has to follow that sort of tendency. But I think it should not be, you know, pleasing the people with the social media. You should try to use the social media to get them into your museum.
All right. Katrin.
Well, this link between the physical world and the digital world, I think there's most added value. But as it is expensive and time-consuming and resource-consuming, I really have to think about who has to do what. And what we can provide is data on our collections or insights, how the Venus from Willendorf looks from Vienna, something like this we can provide. But there's a large community outside. And for me, the added value is this open link data that they make other connections, scientific connections, artistical connection, whatever connections. And that can be really an added value. With regard to resources, I have to say it's currently so much easier to get resources for all this digital stuff than to really care for our physical objects. And yeah, we really have a problem with regard to resources. We also need manpower. To protect against humanity, against anybody, to really look for our physical objects. It's much more difficult to get a work for this core business than to make all this fancy digital stuff. Of course, we do this digital fancy stuff to show the value of our objects and to open the collections, because otherwise it's dead. So it's also, it's a great opportunity for us to go into the digital world.
Right. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, and the topic already surfaced. These are times of dire economy, probably. We are heading, it's headwinds. How are you facing that? How are you, because there's never money to spare in the scientific culture area, but now probably it's going to be harder. What are your plans for the foreseeable future?
Looking at me? Yeah. So we lost in the last, let's say, 6-7 years, we lost about 30% of our budget.
30?
Yeah. And because we had good general directors, we managed not to have to fire too many people. But it means that our consumable work budget has gone down a lot. Mm-hmm. So we managed so far to keep most people. We lost people, and that's with contracts not being renewed, people that retire not being renewed. But we never had to really fire people. Yeah. So that's thanks to the ingenious work of our general directors. Congratulations to them. However, if you then go now, after all this time, you go into discussion with the politicians, then they say, you don't need more money, you managed to keep all your people.
Sure. Yeah.
So what we try to do, we have now about 40% of proper means, which means museum projects, paid services, and 60% coming from the government, what we call the dotation. Yeah? We try to reverse that, so that we will have more proper means, because we see our dotation going down anyway. This seems to be our future. So we have to be more, generate our own more income.
Sorry, why? Is there a reason for that? Shrinking of the
because look, Belgium is the country which the worst budgetary situation in Europe. We have like 120% of our annual budget as debt.
All right.
We have like 3, 4, 5% of deficit on our annual budgets. Our governments try to help people and industry with go through the COVID period, go through the energy crisis, go through inflation, but they're spending money which isn't there. Everybody knows, they know, but they try to do what they can. But at some stage, the money that isn't there but that has been spent has to be found again. And we are in target position because natural history museums are not necessarily top priority of politicians. Yeah, it all depends also on what Europe will do with because we really, this is now not going about natural history museums. It's really about budgetary systems in the coming years for European countries and what Europe will do and how they will actually impose again the restrictions they had pre-COVID. How much our government will have to save. On their budgets and how much we will feel that. So we are trying to arm ourselves by generating more proper income. I told you already we have installed a research office with people that are trying to help our scientists to get more money in different ways, like a real project manager, then there's somebody who is actually doing lobbying in different ways to see that our subjects, that they are more invisible in calls for all sorts of from funding agencies. It's really working proactively to try and find ways to increase our proper income, because we know almost certainly that from our government we will not have to expect high increases in the coming years. Hopefully this is a short-term problem, but it could also be a very long-term problem. Nobody has a crystal ball, of course, at this stage. We have no idea.
Brigitte, what are your plans?
Yes, of course, it's a lot about fundraising, as Koen already said, and this relates very much also to the place where you are, and we are kind of lucky in Frankfurt so far, at least, because it's this banking town, there is money around, so we have a very successful fundraising team and fundraising strategy in all over Senckenberg, who is occupied also with research fundraising, but who are also interested and occupied with museum fundraising. And the good thing about it is that the museum is so visible. So people love to invest there because there's an instantaneous payback, so to speak, in that what you see and how you relate as a company, as a bank, with the results, with the exhibitions we show. But one important thing also I would love to mention during crisis is again the collections, because as a museum you always can rely on what is already there and try to interpret that newly. I mean, not to paint it too much on the wall, but of course we could also do visits with flashlights or in winter coats if it's getting too cold. We could do that. I mean, it's not the ideal. I do not want to wish it, but it's possible. So let's face it.
Katrin, how about you?
Well, one is personal, that's most of the costs we also have, but something else is energy. And already before the war in the Ukraine, we started to establish more solar panels, for instance, on our roof. We will reduce energy use of the house. And we have alleys. So there are other national museums in Vienna, and we have joint project to really assess what is our carbon dioxide footprint to really reduce our energy consumption. And I personally would like to have geoenergy. It's a bit difficult because we are in the middle of Vienna. Well, and for the fancy things, I run for third-party money, and also look for allies in Europe to have projects together with regard to the digitalization of the collections. We have a consortium with other museums and university collections in Austria that not everybody has to invent again all the standards, all the courses, all the capacity building, which is necessary really to work together. Yeah, but it's a challenge.
Can I just ask you, add two more things? So you mentioned geothermy. Yeah, it's a nice story for us because our geologists are studying geothermy, which they shouldn't because it's a regional matter, but they do it anyway. And so they had a contract from the European Parliament. We are right next to the European Parliament on a rather high side of Brussels, one of the hills of Brussels. Rome has 7, we have 1. So apparently the place where the European Parliament is ideal for geothermal energy. Seriously. So they're going to almost certainly install the whole European Parliament based on geothermal energy. And we are in negotiation that once they have heated up the whole Parliament, what is left? Can we have it, please? Now, another thing is that we heard yesterday from Kirk that they get quite a lot of money from private people who do charity. And the question was, he asked the question, why isn't that so in Europe? And I have been nagging for many years to our different general directors to start investigating that. But the answer was always that the fiscal advantage for people is much less here than it is in America. Sure. So, and I'm sure it's in Belgium. I have no idea how it is in other countries, but I was assured that it is like that in most of Europe, right. Which is a real drawback. I mean, if we could change that, then natural history museums would be on the list of charity we would actually be much better off. It would be a way out of certainly for museums that struggle, with budgets like ours.
You're next to the European Parliament. Just, knock.
Yeah, knock on the door.
Tell them about it.
Our first sponsoring dinner, and in fact, to receive a collection from UK, a rather important collection on birds. But the birds won't cost us too much money, but to digitize the birds and to put them into our collection and to make everything nice, we need money, and it will be our first sponsoring dinner. But in contrast to Germany, for instance, in Austria, there are no associations and nobody is going to fund this. So the cultures are also different within Europe.
I would like to add something concerning the significance of museums, because this is a question of crisis, which comes up during the crisis too. And during COVID, I think it was shocking for all of us that we had to close down, even if we could have delivered some sense beyond the mere medical issues which were discussed. And we experience this very closely now, also with the war in Ukraine, because refugees are hosted very near to the museum, and we immediately opened up the museum for them. And it's really heartbreaking also to see that they want to come, that they love to be in a secure place, in a place of knowledge, in a place where they can relax. So it's also about atmospheres you provide and being guest-friendly, so to speak, towards the people who are in crisis.
Thank you. Well, Brigitte, Koen, Katrin, thank you so very much. We're 1 minute above time, so it's been a pleasure. Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's working now. Okay, I just have to say briefly a few words, just because we are all a little bit tired of the whole session. So just a few words just to grab all this what we have been hearing today and to say farewell to our guests. So first I have to thank the directors, because I know they have pretty tough agendas, so I'm really glad that they were able to come here and make it. So I have to thank them. And I think that to celebrate our 250th anniversary. So thank you very much for coming. And I think that after 1 day and a half, I speak on myself. I think I'm pleased to say that the initial goals that I have when I have in mind this meeting have been fulfilled beyond expectations. So I'm very glad that all this, what we have been hearing these days. And first I have the impression, as just something that Brigitte just said, to me, I every time that I go to any city, I go and visit the museum, the Natural History Museum, and I feel at home in any other place, in the other museums. So, because we all look the same at the end. This is a nice, peaceful place that you can relax and see science around, and so I can see that there are many common things that, despite we have very different budgets, we have very different peculiarities in our home countries, we have different opportunities for funding and so on. Then at the end, really we are very peculiar institutions, and we are very homogeneous in a sense, because we have our three main missions that we have been talking these days, which is research, collections, and exhibitions, and that has not changed in the centuries we are already having. So that's very good. And I see the second, I guess the main message behind this these 2 days is that because we are so homogeneous and we have very clear our missions, and the missions are the same, we can really get together, we can network, have this idea of a global museum. I think this is not a dream, but something that we can construct in the next few years. And I think that's the most important thing, that is the way that we can go, we can make better science, and then we can, doing better science, we can really try to confront the challenges of biodiversity crisis, environmental crisis. Is the only way. And I think I'm glad that we all have very clear this idea. And then, of course, the other important challenge that we have in the museums is to attract people, to engage people, not only to engage people in visiting us and see our exhibitions, but also in engaging public or society in our activities, in citizen science, open science, and so on. It's more than just having them here, showing them, educating them on what is science, but get them to participate. And of course, we were this morning talking about reckoning issues which can be afforded this way, by this idea of digitalization, global open science within a global museum, by getting the society involved. As Bruno was saying, also the idea of not only asking them to come, first go and pick them, sending the message out, and then asking them to then come here, because if not, it's not done. So there will be many ideas going around, and I think those ideas are very fruitful, and so I think it was worth having all you here. Besides that, we haven't had nice fun and drinks and meals. So I have just to finish thanking our staff, and in particular Borja Milá, who has been really doing a lot of work. And to all of you for attending this forum. Thank you. Bye.